All right, so now we're going to talk about drum kit. Drums, acoustic drums, are one of the toughest things to record and mix, and the reason is because it's not simply a singular instrument, but it's actually many instruments coming together to make one instrument. It's kind of the same reason why medicine is tough, because everything's interconnected, and when you do one thing, it affects everything else. So, this is going to be my approach to drums for the context of this record, going through some of the ideas and things that I visit whenever I'm taking on acoustic drums. But my process is in development. I'm still figuring out new things, so hopefully this will bring you up to speed on some really cool stuff. So first of all, like everything else, we need to just listen for what we already have. So just in general, I would say that this is very apparently a good recording. If it wasn't, we wouldn't have such a solid image of the drums within the context of the record itself. But can we improve things? Well, I think that we can. Just to my ear, I feel like the drum kit could be a little bit more glued together. It could be a little bit punchier and stronger and have that stepping out of the speakers kind of impact going on. So let's start getting into the individual things. First of all, I do subgroupings within my drum processing. So the overhead left and overhead right, they come down to one channel. The snare top and snare bottom, they will go to a snare channel, sometimes a parallel snare channel, and then those parallel channel and dry channel will get summed into one channel as well. If I have multiple kick captures, they will get down to one single kick auxiliary bus, and then all of it at the end of the day is going to filter down to a kit so that I can affect everything on every level. I can get to the minutia of working the snare bottom, or I can simply affect the entire kit. So once that's put together, I then start pulling apart what I want from the overheads and from the snare and from the kick. So my starting point is usually from the big picture. I want to get an idea of what the overheads sound like and what the room captures sound like, because that's the picture of the kit as a whole. And that's going to be the basis for our sound. So let's start with the overheads. So when I'm listening to overheads, there's a couple of different things that I'll be listening for. The first is going to be stereo image, because I think that this is really important. I would say about 4 out of 5 times, I want the stereo image to be very concentric, meaning I want the kick and snare to appear as if they're coming from the phantom center, and I want everything else that isn't a center part of the kit to be on the sides. Well, this sounds like it's good. It sounds like it was captured in a way where everything was lined up right and where you're getting a very solid central image. So there are a few cases where the image will be leaning to one side or another. When that's the case, sometimes you actually have to just live with it. But it's important to check for things like phase. So for example, if we were to zoom in and take a look at these snares, for example, we see that the snare drum on the left and the snare drum on the right are hitting at almost exactly the same time. They are basically completely lined up, and that's part of why we hear it coming from the center. If we were to have them out of alignment, suddenly now, it sounds like the snare is coming from the left. And the reason for this is because the way our brains determine direction isn't based on amplitude alone, it's also based on time. And so small timing discrepancies can lead our minds to go, oh, that's coming from that direction or that direction. But when the time is equal, then it comes from the center. The other reason why we might hear something leaning to the left or to the right is amplitude differences. Right? There's just so much more dominating level coming from the right speaker in this case that our ear goes, oh, that's coming from the right. So checking the level between the overheads is another important factor. There is a third reason, and it's a little bit complicated, and that is disproportionate frequency responses. If you are using mismatched overheads, for example, or you are using overheads where one is out of alignment to the image that it's picking up and creating a different frequency response, that can also cause the image to be lopsided, and I'm going to include a video on fixing that up as well, but I'm not going to do it at this very moment because I don't want to distract from the process. But anyway, everything is in time and basically balanced, so we don't have to necessarily correct those things at the moment. Now it's just a question of whether or not this overhead sound is what we want. So this sound reminds me very much of like an old school break. It's very dry, it's all overhead right now, and it's pretty unprocessed. It's very open sounding. What I'd like to do is sort of modernize this a little bit more and get something that's more in the realm of rock and roll rather than like a funk type of track or a 70s disco or R&B type of track. So the way I'm going to do that is by making the entire capture a little bit denser. I'm going to try and sharpen the snare and also bring up the level of all of the different cymbals and things like that. And I'm going to do that with our old friend compression. I've been playing around with the Empirical Labs Arouser plugin. Sadly, it's called the Arouser plugin, so you're going to have to bear with me when I am referring to the Arouser. But it's basically a clone of a distressor. So I'm going to set it pretty quickly here. I wish that it defaulted to 5 and 5, but it doesn't. So I'm going to set it to 5 and 5 before I even hear anything, and then start making determinations. So off the bat, I'm hearing two things. The first is that the vibe of the compression feels good, but it's just squeezing way too much. So we're going to start to work around that. First thing I got to do is I got to slow the attack down because I'm losing all of the edge of my snare. So when I'm listening to this, I want the attack of the snare to poke through, but I don't want it to like jump through in leaps and bounds. If I slow the attack down too much, it becomes really dominating sounding. I mean, not as much as the uncompressed signal, but I think that finding something that's a nice medium of something that is very clearly compressed, but not letting so much of the leading edge through as a good choice. Because remember, we're trying to glue everything together here. The other thing that I want to do is bring out that sort of release tone, because if you hear that the ambient noise in the capture, there's a rhythm to it that's really working. The size of the room is fitting very nicely with the groove. Bum bum ba bum bum ba bum. There's a little bit of that groove in the release. So I'm going to speed up the release, and that's going to bring up the room tone. If I speed it up too much, kind of get a chunky and sort of extra tense sound, which can actually be good in some contexts, but I think for something that we're trying to keep sounding natural, we don't want to be too aggressive with that release time. And the other thing that I like to do whenever I'm working with a distressor in particular is to play around with the different ratios, because the ratios will also affect the curves of the attack and the release, specifically the 10-to-1, which is going to be designed to fit that optical style of attack and release where it's a little slower at the front and speeds up as it goes. So, and then the release being faster as it begins and it slows down. So let's play around with that real quick. Yeah, that sounds really good, actually. Here's the 6-to-1. Here's the 10-to-1. I feel like I'm picking up some of the inside groove of the hi-hats a little better. I feel like the release of and how that's affecting the groove of the room tone is a little bit better. I also kind of like the texture that I'm getting on the snare a little bit better. So it's really cool to sort of play around with these different things. And, you know, it's never bad to just sort of switch on each one and just instinctively, if you hear something you like, just keep it there. Now, I am losing a little bit of the natural front edge on the snare and the cymbals, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this blend knob, and I'm going to set it so that a little bit of the natural uncompressed sound does poke through. And now I'm going to level match them, because remember, this is still a little bit quieter. Before. After. And right off the bat, we're already beginning to see the full picture here. Now we're getting a much more forceful sound, we're getting a denser sound, we're getting a more consistent and polished sound, so we're starting to make improvements all around. Now, in terms of the tone of the overheads, I like the tone, actually. I think that it's very well balanced, so I think that this is a good recording. I think that it could use a little bit more bite, and that the cymbals could come forward a little bit more. Now, before I change anything on the EQ curve, what I want to do is bring in the snare top. Those sound really good together, and that's important to acknowledge. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a trim plugin, and I know that if I flip the polarity on this, the snare is going to suddenly sound really weak. Right? It very quickly sounds hollow and a little muddy, and that's because the snare is in phase with the overheads. As soon as I flip the polarity, it's out of phase. Now, why do I mention this? Well, it's because when we EQ things, we inherently change the phase makeup of the signal. So if we were to bring in an EQ, with the snare, it sounds like this. Before, after. Now, it certainly doesn't sound bad, but watch what happens if I put it into linear phase mode. Notice how the image of the snare sounds a lot crisper and a lot more solid. One more time. Natural phase mode, which is a minimal phase variation. It sounds good, but it sounds a touch washier. It doesn't sound quite as punchy. And the reason is that the linear phase mode is keeping the overall phase relationship of the signal the same. And so the top end is no longer changing its phase relationship with the top of the snare. This is really important when we're working with drums. Now, sometimes changing the phase relationship between different drums is actually a good thing, particularly if they weren't really totally in phase to begin with. But sometimes it can be a bad thing as well, so we have to keep our ears open and we have to really listen for how the edges and definition of things holds up when we start changing the EQ balances. All right, so now that we're on the subject of the snare, going back to the same subject of phase, the very first thing that I do is try and get the very best relationship between the bottom snare and the top snare. So when I pull in the bottom snare, I definitely notice that the sound becomes a little bit bigger, and it generally is constructive. However, I'm not convinced that it's the best phase relationship. Getting the phase right between the top snare and the bottom snare is extremely difficult. It takes a lot of time, and sometimes when we're recording, we simply don't have the time to get it spot on perfect because we want to capture the moment. And if we spend 30 minutes getting the phase perfect between the top snare and the bottom snare, the drummer is going to get bored and lose energy. So what I've done is I've used the InPhase plugin. This is a plugin that I've talked about a good number of times. The basic idea is that I'm feeding the sidechain with the snare top, keeping the main signal as the snare bottom, and then moving the snare bottom around in time in very slight amounts to see if I can get a more conducive phase relationship between the two. So here's the before. And And so it's not a huge change. I'll play it one more time, but what I want you to do is listen to the definition, listen to the dimensionality of it, how much it steps out of the speaker, and really listen to like the definition of the edge, the transient of the snare itself. Right, there's a little more punch and a little bit more snap, and overall it's a little bit more defined. So this wasn't vastly out of phase by any stretch. We're talking 35 samples. 35 samples is like, I don't know, maybe that much. Like it's not a huge distance, but just tightening it up that little bit really helps things go the extra mile. So now I'm going to pull in the overheads and listen again. So the snare sounds really good. What I want from it is to sound a little bit sharper and to have a little bit more power to it. Like, it's really not bad if I pull it into the mix as is. It sounds like a very country snare. I want to make it a little bit more rock. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a transient designer to sort of pull up the attack and bite of the snare in the overall sound. Before. After. And I'm going to exaggerate that real quick. So all I'm really doing here is just trying to get the snare to float above the speakers a little bit, to kind of have that extra bit of stepping out from the tweeter. And that's a subtle thing that it doesn't massively make a huge difference. You sense more life. There's more bounce and more energy and more dimension to it. And sometimes it's these things that kind of give us that wow factor where you know, other people listening kind of say, how does it sound so vivid? What's missing when I do it? Well, sometimes it's these subtle things. So after that, what I want to do is just sort of fill out the overall sense of the snare. Tonally speaking, I don't mind that it's maybe a slightly darker snare than what you would find in like most contemporary rock tunes or pop rock tunes. I don't mind that, but maybe just to bring out a little bit of that extra bottom and a little bit of that extra top. And the way I'm going to do it is with a parallel return. So here's just the snare as is, and then here it is with the parallel return. Right? It's just making it, it's not hugely changing things, but it's making it feel fuller. It's making it feel more powerful. It's giving it a little bit more definition. So let's check out what's going on here. So the Snarelel channel, which is what I like to call it because I'm a dork, is, it's the same as the snare channel itself, except it's got a little more going on. I'm tucking down the overall level of the snare, and then I'm EQing it. And for contouring style EQing, I really like this E27 EQ from PSP. It's got this way of being sort of like smooth and assertive at the same time, which I like. And what I'm doing is giving it a little bit of top end here, like just a couple of dB to sort of bring out the sizzly part and the snare part. But then I'm giving it a whole ton of low end, that resonant drum shell ring that is providing the weight and the body for the snare. And so it's important to find the right corner frequencies too, because, you know, if I change this up to here, it's a little bit flubby and a little bit muddy sounding. That's pretty good. That actually feels like the root of the tone. So this might actually be better, this 200 hertz band. Yeah, the 200 hertz is actually better, and I can back it off just a touch. And maybe I'm going to add a touch more top. So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that core resonance, and I'm looking for that sizzly top. And then I do my parallel compression. So once again, using this distressor plugin. Now, the difference here is that what I'm really trying to do is bring up the body and fullness. And so my attack is going to be much faster on my compressor. If I have too long of an attack, I'm going to get a very smacky sound. And sometimes we want to build transient in, so using a longer attack can be good. But in this case, I'm using just enough attack so that I don't end up rounding out the transient of the drum too much, but overall it's pretty fast. And then I'm sort of timing my release to kind of feel right. I could use a faster release, and that's going to control how forward the sound becomes. Now, if I do it too much, it starts to lose its dimensionality. So I want to find a release that's as full as possible without it sounding like I've turned this into a snare sample. I want it to still sound like the real drum. That sounds pretty darn good to me. All right, and then the input and output, that's just about getting the right amount of compression going. Now, I'm going to bypass the EQ and play it real quick. Right, so this is what we're pushing underneath our main snare, and you can hear how this is going to give us a little bit more excitement and a little bit more energy this way. So now I'm going to pull in the main snare. I'm going to take out the EQ. We get this really cutting mid-range kind of sound. When I pull the EQ back in, we get a fuller sound, so it gets a little bit more weight and a little bit more top. All right, let's hear that in the mix. Also, let's use the same transient designer. All right, and with our overhead. Without the EQ. Sounds pretty good. It's got an exciting, a crack to it that really livens things up, but it's also super mid-range forward. Bring the EQ in. Weight and body, and just for fun. Interesting. I actually like the lower corner frequency, I think, to be honest. Yep, maybe I changed that, actually, because when I pull everything together, it sounds better. Yeah, that's probably what happened. So, lesson in that as well. Keep those ears open. All right, let's take care of this hi-hat right here real quick. So the hi-hat, and this is very common of hi-hats, has a lot of bleed in it. So the first thing that I'm doing is just to get the pan positioning right. Right now we're audience perspective, so I'm just going to put the hi-hat to match that. We can always flip the image later if we want. Now, I'm also not the type to get married to the idea of, like, drummer's perspective versus audience perspective or whatever. I do think that there's merit to the argument that, people like to air drum, and if you're air drumming, you really want the hi-hat to be on the left. That said, I'm more inclined to figure out, how does the hi-hat and brightness of the hi-hat balance against something that might be on the other side of the stereo field. That, to me, is a more relevant discussion. Now, if we built this mix from the drums up, then, start with whatever we like, and then from there we can change it. But also, I don't think it really totally impacts the success of the record. The next thing that we need to consider is the balance of the position of the snare from the hi-hat bleed. Are starting to lean the image of the snare slightly right in terms of its energy. So what I want to do is cut down on the amount of snare that's there. I'm going to use this drum leveler program as my compressor. A normal compressor would work. This is just going to do it a little bit more cleanly because what it does is it identifies the snare as a singular sample and then affects that in a unilateral way, as opposed to going through a release and a, in any way, shape, or form changing the shape of the snare itself. And as soon as I do that, you hear the solidity of the snare jump back to the center. Okay, next thing. The kick. Sounds like a kick. Definitely needs a little bit of work. So again, let's do the first thing, which is to check the phase. Sometimes it can be a little tough to tell right off the bat. So what I'll do is I'll just highlight one hit. And overall, it feels to me that it's already in a decent phase position. So we are going to leave it as is. All right, the next thing is going to be some EQ. Within the kick itself, and by the way, I'm not as concerned with the phase relationship between the kick and the overheads because there's just not as much kick in the overheads as there is snare in the overheads, and we can always use a low pass, a high pass or a low shelf to attenuate low end from the overheads later if we feel like it's too roomy or there's some kind of interference and we need to tighten it up. All right, so now let's take a look at some EQ. All of this kick energy is concentrated right into that hummy sort of shell tone that's happening. So what we want to do is start focusing the energy on the highs and the lows rather than the mid-range. So the first thing that I want to do is take out a whole bunch of this low tone here. Right? That's sort of like shell tone overtone. We really don't need it. And what we get is what I would call a tighter sounding kick. It's smackier. There's less of the resonance in there and less of the tone in there and more of the attack and the weight that we're hearing. So next step, I'm going to start pulling up some of that attack. And basically, how much attack we want is relative to the music itself. I don't think that this record needs to be too attacky. If this was like a metal record or something like that, then we would be like, boom. Right? A lot of styles of more aggressive rock, we're going to have that much, much brighter sound to our kick. This one, I want to have a little bit more of that classic rock influence on the sound. I'm still considering it kind of a pop rockish kind of tune, with some country influence, but I also want a little classic rock influence in there as well. So that's going to determine how I'm going to set the top end of the kick. I think that's pretty good. And then I also want to pull up the fundamental low end, which is going to be the power and the weight of the kick. So when I take the EQ off, put it back on, not really entirely level match, so I'm also going to turn the level up as well. And then the last thing that I like to do to get a little bit more power and size into a kick drum is to use Decapitator. Decapitator is a distortion plugin. Now, traditionally, what one would do with a kick drum would be to use some compression to kind of pull the very fast part of the attack down a little bit into the sustain, because that's going to create a punchier sound. It's going to create a longer duration attack, which is going to be felt as a heavier amount of punch, plus it's going to enhance the sustain, which is going to give it a bigger bottom. This is doing that, but it's doing that on the most aggressive level, because I'm using clipping to do it, which acts faster than compression. And so I'm getting harmonic distortion, but I'm getting it over such a short range of time, it doesn't really throw off the ear. And if you look at the peak meter, you can actually see that I am shaving off the peaks a little bit and giving myself a little bit more room for the overall mix to get louder at the end of the day. And in a world where loudness is a consideration, this is one of those headroom management things that sometimes can be very useful. So before, after. Also, fun little part of Decapitator is this thump control. All it is a very steep filter, but I can set it so that it sort of brings up the sub of the kick itself. Interesting. Now, remember what I was saying about how EQ can change phase relationships? I just want to experiment with this for a second. I feel like now that I've done so many things with the EQ, I'm actually getting a slightly more defined low end when I flip the phase. Yeah, I'm getting a little bit more low end definition. Now, I wouldn't exactly say that the kick is super strong yet. And I think that in order to get this kick to be really strong, we kind of have two options. We can either really just get balls to the wall, down and dirty with the processing, like throw on a limiter, and just sort of try and brute force it into being this really present kick drum. The problem with that is that, once we start crushing with the limiter and maybe using like something like a sub enhancer or an octaver or something to bring out subtones or whatever it may be, the kick is gonna sort of start to sound like something it isn't. And once we're doing that, I feel like the more effective way to go about this is to actually trigger a sample. Now, right off the bat, you should probably be thinking, wow, that sample sounds really good. It makes the kick sound really big, but it doesn't seem to really change the character of the kick too much. It just blends really nicely. So what I want to do is break down how I'm finding a sample that works really well with this particular kick. One more time before and after. So a lot of the times when we're picking a sample and we're going for something that's going to reinforce an acoustic drum, a lot of people will choose to find an acoustic drum sample. I think that's a mistake. I think that it's actually better to go with a cleaner drum machine sounding sample, and here's my reasoning why. All of the character of the kick is going to be in the mid-range. It's going to be from like 200 hertz to, maybe 5K where the click starts to show up, and clicks are more or less interchangeable. So what I want to do is I want to find a drum that doesn't have a lot of that. So I want something that's like an 808 or a 909 or a stock SP1200 type drum, where it's just a big hearty sub with a little bit of distortion in there for some character and tone in there just to tuck it in, and then some kind of a click or top end type of thing that's just going to sharpen up the overall sound and make the ear find it a little bit better. So here's the sample that I picked. And just in soloing it, you also realize how quiet it is relative to the amount of change that it makes. So, okay, now how do I pick the right one? Well, I go through my samples and I just start with one that in and of its core seems to blend well. The only way to do that is to have an idea of what you want and then go through sample after sample, playing it and triggering it and seeing, okay, which one seems like it's blending nicely. But the other consideration is the tone of the drum, because when we're talking about drum machine drums, particularly like 808, 909, SP1200 style drums, they tend to be very tonal. So when I'm doing this, what I like to do is grab Celemoni Melodyne. Let's go back to the original tuning of the drum. And actually pull it into Melodyne to check the tuning exactly. Okay, so our tuning is coming up just a little bit flat of an A flat. The key of our song is D flat. So A flat is exactly a fifth above D flat. Musically speaking, A flat should blend very nicely into this record. It's going to be in key with the tune. The problem is that we're not really quite on an A flat. So I'm going to take this out real quick. Now, let me tune this sample up a little bit so that we're more in the pocket of the A flat. You notice how that immediately sprung to life? I'll go back to the original tuning. So we want to be somewhere between pitched up like 2 or 3. It's kind of hard to pick one that's sort of negotiable. I think I like 3 better. So original tuning. Not bad. New tuning. It just locks in. It feels like it's musically part of the song now. And that's why this sample is really blending, because not only is it working well with the original kick, not only is it allowing the mid-range of the kick, the original kick, to shine through and retain its character, but on top of all that, it's also harmonically in tune with the rest of the record. So we're making a lot of progress here. We're really getting along. I think that, just as a quick note, I think that the drum kit could be a little bit brighter, so I'm just going to add some top end here real quick. And then what we need to do is start constructing a room.